And here, let me just change this. And I put together a little PowerPoint tonight because the longer I was on this project, because I've been on this project since it started in 2017, the more I realized doing the research how little I really understood about those times, about slavery, about Harriet Tubman. So in putting this together, I'm going to kind of go over very quickly, but still bring out some of these points that I found out about after arriving at the park. So let me share my screen. And this. There it goes. Perfect. So we are a unit of the National Park Service. So there are quite a few national parks in the state of New York, and Harriet Tubman National Historical Park is one of the newest ones. And that's why in 2017, it was imperative to have someone on the ground to build the partnerships and to learn the story and build the interpretive programs. So we do know Harriet Tubman was born about 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. And we kind of confirm this with two things. One is that her owner actually hired a midwife for Harriet Tubman's mother, Rit. And also, when Harriet Tubman escapes on her own in 1849, there's an advertisement for her capture, and it says she's 27 years old. So based on those two things, we come up with her being born in 1822. So we just finished celebrating her bicentennial. Now, when I'm starting to do some of this research, I found out that our first 12 presidents, 10 of them are slave owners, including George Washington, of course, Thomas Jefferson. And when they're writing the Constitution, our founding fathers, in 1789, there's this huge argument over enslavement. No one can come to any consensus. It is just such a contentious issue that they decide they're going to table the issue for 20 years, just not going to discuss it. And they thought within 20 years, they probably wouldn't have to discuss it. They thought that slavery was going to die its own death. And they weren't wrong. The main reason that enslaved people are brought over from Africa at this time was to work on tobacco. But tobacco depletes the soil, and a lot of farmers had turned away from tobacco and started to grow cyclical crops and turned to timbering. So they manumitted, they freed their slaves, and it was cheaper to do this and then hire them back during the planting and harvesting season. So all of this changes in 1793 with the invention of the cotton gin. Now, gin is just short for engine. It's a very simple machine. It's just a wooden box with a drum in it. They put bristles on the outside of the drum and a crank, and you put raw cotton in and you crank away, and the bristles will scrape the fibers off the seeds. Seeds drop down, and then you can take the cotton off of the drum. Now, prior to the cotton gin, cotton is not profitable. The only profitable cotton was long staple cotton, which is what we call like Egyptian cotton today. It's very fine and soft, and it only grows along the coastal regions of the South. And there, an enslaved person could sit down and take long staple cotton and physically take the fibers off the seeds by hand, producing about 5 pounds per day. With the cotton gin, this is going to make it over 100 pounds per day, but it also makes short staple cotton profitable. And that kind of cotton will grow on a rock, and it's almost impossible to get the fibers off the seeds. So this is where the cotton gin makes that profitable. And if you look at just what you have on, guaranteed, you have on short staple cotton. It's in our clothes, our money, our books, it's everywhere. It's still a major commodity. So Congress is looking at all these people rushing down south to buy land to be able to grow short staple cotton. And they figured, well, we should expand this land, the United States, to be able to grow and prosper under short staple cotton. So in comes the Mississippi Territory in 1798, future states of Mississippi and Alabama. Then the Louisiana Purchase, that doubles the size of the country. Then they also bring in the New Orleans Territory because If you don't have the control of the mouth of the Mississippi, you can't control the trade. And that's why New Orleans territory came in. And then we have 20 years is up, January 1st, 1808. So by this time, we have Thomas Jefferson is in the White House. And of all the presidents who owned slaves, he owned the most at over 600 in his lifetime. So on January 1st, 1808, he shuts down the transatlantic slave trade, just shuts it right down. So a lot of abolitionists on first blush, they're thinking, oh, this is amazing. This is just going to cut down on slavery. We're going to finally see an end to this. But in essence, what happened is he took out the competition. So no longer can you get an enslaved person from Africa. Now it's going to be having to trade within the state. So this starts the domestic slave trade. So those slaves that are especially in the northern part of the southern states, the Virginia and Tennessee area, these enslaved people, as well as Maryland, are going to be sold down south, over 1 million almost immediately after this passes. And those slaves are sold south to the cotton plantations. And then the new crop is going to be, this is in the northern part of the southern states, children. And Thomas Jefferson did know what he was doing with this. He actually wrote a letter home to his overseer and said, the money is now in their issue. One child born every 2 years is worth more than the work of a full-grown man. Let the women care for the babies so they don't die. Because mortality rate was over 50% for enslaved children at this time. So he's stressing, let the women care for the babies so they don't die, so we can sell them when they're 2 and 3 years old. So this is the new crop. And right about this time, we also have the igniting of the U.S. Industrial Revolution. And it's going to start off in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1813 with the integrated factory system. And all this is that bale of cotton coming up from the south is going to go into the factory on the first floor where it's carded, and it's going to be cleaned, and then it's going to be spun, woven, dyed, and come off the top floor as a bolt of cloth. So it's bale to bolt. And this is going to be the first mass-produced products that's going to be shipped worldwide. And everyone wanted this cloth because prior to the integrated factory system, if you wanted to get a new outfit, you had to start planning about a year or longer in advance, because that's how long it took you from start to finish. Now you can go to the store and buy cloth already made. You just buy what you need, go home, cut it out, sew it up, and you have your new outfit. So for women especially, this was a very liberating thing to be able to go to the store and buy cloth. So what has this all got to do with Harriet Tubman? What it is that Harriet Tubman lives in Maryland, one of those breeder states. And 3 of her sisters, Mariah, Lena, and Soph, are sold into that vacuum that is being sold, all those enslaved people being sold south to the cotton plantations. And as you notice their ages here, this is the age that they're wanted between 16 and 22 years old, because not only can you work them, you can breed them. So Harriet will witness 2 of those 3 sales. And she will forever be very marred by this. She remembered very clearly into her old age their screams and cries as they're being taken away. And she remembered the grief that her parents went through going through the loss of those children. And just as the caveat, we also, all that land that's being purchased by the United States down south, there's many different Native American tribes on those lands. And to make sure that they were removed so that the cotton could be planted on those lands, we have the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that will culminate in the Trail of Tears in 1838. So you can kind of see all of this kind of coming together. And this is the world Harriet Tubman is born into. On the eastern shore of Maryland, we have a lot of wetlands. Harriet herself at 5 years old is going to be leased out to another enslaver. And she is put out into these swamps in the wintertime to check muskrat traps, because of course the muskrat have very thick fur at this particular juncture. So that's why she's out there. And they're not giving her the proper food, clothing, any kind of medical care. So she gets very ill and then sent back to her mother, who then brings her back to health. And she will then be sent out again to another enslaver, and this time to a woman who had just had a baby. And that woman was notorious for her abuse of enslaved people. And she carried a whip in her hand all the time. And she told 6-year-old Araminta Ross, Harriet Tubman's original name, she told her, if my baby cries, this whip is what you're going to get. And of course, that's what babies do, is cry. So she was whipped unmercifully by this woman. And it was said that you could see the scars on the top of Harriet Tubman's collar the rest of her life on her skin. So just this horrible existence there. She's then deemed not worthy to be a house slave, and she's sent back, where she is then sent to work with her father out in the timberlands and also out in the fields. At about 13 years old, she is sent to the store. This is a rebuilt store. And as she's walking in the door, an enslaved person is running out. And that overseer of that enslaved person yelled to Harriet to stop that slave. But she didn't. She just stepped back and he ran out. So the overseer picks up this 2-pound counterweight and he hurls it. Here's this full-grown man. You can see how small the store is. And he just hurls it at that escaping slave and misses him and hit Harriet right in the head, crushing in her skull. And we think from this head injury, she develops temporal lobe epilepsy. So she will start having epileptic seizures. She will start having sleeping spells, a type of narcolepsy. So she can be talking to you one minute and the next minute, sound asleep. And she can sleep upwards of an hour. And when she wakes up, she actually can pick up exactly in the sentence where she was left off. So the other thing that happens is when Harriet is asleep, when she has those sleeping spells, she has very vivid visions and dreams. Now, she has a lot of different religious training as she's growing up, from her grandmother Modesty teaching her some of her native culture and religion, to having to go to these different churches when she's out working for other people. So she has training in everything from Catholicism to Baptist. And it looks like she melds this all together and then mixes this with these visions and believes that it is her God speaking directly to her. And for the rest of her life, she will follow this voice. And when that voice goes quiet, because that voice is her guidance, she gets very angry and she goes, you put me on this course and now you choose to be quiet. What do you want me to do now? So it was this very much daily back and forth conversation that she's having with her God. She will marry when she's about 23 years old, and this is when she marries John Tubman. And so she will drop Araminta, take her mother's name, Harriet, and then drops her maiden name, Ross, and then takes her husband's name, Tubman. So from then on, she is Harriet Tubman. She will then go to her owner and ask her owner, look, let me lease myself out. And then I will give you $60 a year, provided that I can keep the rest of the money. And when I have enough money, I'm going to buy my freedom from you. So he agrees. He goes, this is great. Go right ahead. So Harriet's out working very hard. She's saving what money she can. She pays him the $60 a year. And then a couple of years go by and her owner dropped dead. So he's very young. He's only in his 40s. So it was very much a surprise that he passed away. But his widow found out that he had left her deep in debt, which is probably why he accepted Harriet Tubman's offer in the first place. So the widow decides, you know what? I know what we're going to do, because of course that arrangement with Harriet Tubman and her deceased husband is now null and void. And she can't enter into a contract. So this is just nothing now. She says, we're going to sell property. And so what she's doing is selling some of her enslaved people. And she chooses Harriet and 2 of Harriet Tubman's brothers to sell to pay off some of this debt. So here's their choice. They can either go north or they can go south, or they can stay put. So if they go north, they know somewhere up there, there's freedom. They don't know where it is. They don't have any money. They don't have any maps, no connections. And of course, as soon as they head north, then they can just be caught at any time with slave catchers and whatnot. So very scary if they go north. They can stay put exactly where they are because that sale may not come about for maybe 2 to 6 weeks, maybe even a little bit longer, and they could spend every last minute with their families. And of course, going south, that just means that they're going to be out in the cotton fields. They know they've never heard from their 3 sisters again. They've only heard about the horror stories of working on the cotton plantations. So these are their only choices. So what they chose is to go north. And so they leave, the 3 of them, but the 2 brothers start to get very nervous with this. And so they decide, we need to turn around and go back. And one of the brothers was a new father, and he was having a very difficult time just leaving his family behind. So for him, it was, just, I've got to go back to them. So the 3 return, and a couple of weeks later, then Harriet leaves on her own and gets all the way to Philadelphia. She does not tell anyone where she's going because she doesn't want anybody to get in trouble having known what her actions were. So this is her picture just after the Civil War, but this gives you kind of a good idea of what she looked like about the time that she left. She leaves in 1849. This picture is approximately 1869, 1867. This picture was taken in Auburn, but you can see the youth and power that she has in her person. When she's in Philadelphia, she can't believe what freedom is like. She is just beside herself. She said everything looked brighter and cleaner. She said that she was free, even though she really, technically she wasn't. She's still a fugitive slave, but to her, this is freedom. She got a job. She got to keep all of her own money. She was the master of her life. But not long after being in Philadelphia, she starts to miss family. So she starts to work with a man by the name of William Still, that many call the father of the Underground Railroad. Now, William Still himself was born enslaved, and he had actually started interviewing everybody that was coming through in hopes of reintroducing people to their families down the road, in hopes that there was abolition and people were free. So he was making sure that all the records of anybody coming through, he wrote down. And so if you get his records, which are still on sale today, you see Harriet Tubman coming through his office and the interviews that he does with the people that come through his office. So William Still, he's a good friend of Lucretia Mott, which is how we think Harriet Tubman actually got to meet William Still, is through Lucretia Mott. Now that name may sound familiar because, of course, she's one of the 5 women who create the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. She's also a Quaker, and she's very wealthy. Her home in Philadelphia is open as an Underground Railroad station. And so then after I'm looking through all this, I'm like, okay, well, how did she get to Auburn? What's the connection here? And it turns out Lucretia Mott's sister is Martha Coffin Wright. And Martha Coffin Wright lives in Auburn, New York. And of course, Martha has her house open as a station on the Underground Railroad and becomes a very close friend of Harriet Tubman. And the city of Auburn at this time is a real hub of the Underground Railroad. One of the first people that come to the city of Auburn was Colonel Hardenberg, who he was the one who got the land tract from the military. And he's the one who starts the city. He brings with him Mr. and Mrs. Freeman. And it's the Freemans and their children who start the Underground Railroad in Auburn. So by the time Harriet Tubman comes along about in the early 1850s, it's already a very well-oiled machine, that Underground Railroad in Auburn. And Martha Coffin Wright is definitely a part of it. But then it's like, how did Harriet Tubman buy a house? Well, turns out the Martha Coffin Wright's husband's law partner is Frances Seward's husband, William Seward. And Frances Seward is the true abolitionist in the family. She is also, because of the Married Women's Property Act in New York State, passed just before this, Frances is entitled to all of her inheritance from her father. She splits it only with her sister, but Frances gets to keep it. Prior to the Married Women's Property Act, all that money and land and buildings and businesses would have gone straight to William Seward. This time, it goes straight to Frances. And Frances puts a lot of that money into the Underground Railroad. One of the things Frances also inherited was a small farm on South Street, 7 acres. And in 1859, Harriet Tubman is going to purchase that farm from Frances Seward. I know a lot of the history books talk about William Seward is the one who is selling it, but it is Frances who owns it and has to give permission to sell that property to Harriet Tubman. And this is the land as it looks now with the 2 buildings. The barn has been reconstructed, so it looks very similar to the original. Again, this is 1859. So this is before the Civil War. We have a fugitive enslaved woman in the North in New York State buying land. The house was never used on the Underground Railroad, but it was her property. The brick house is the second one on that site. The first one was a wood frame house that burned to the ground about 1880, same year Harriet Tubman's mother passed away. And Harriet Tubman and her second husband, Nelson Davis, actually made the bricks and built that house. And she'll live in that for a little over 30 years. So this is what you see now when you go there. Now, Harriet Tubman, of course, she brings up, after meeting up with William Still, she will now, over the next decade, she's going to make approximately 13 trips, bringing up about 70 people up on the Underground Railroad. And we know the names of almost all of them because most of them are family and friends. And some will stay in Auburn. Some actually go on to Canada because the Fugitive Slave Act, the second one passed, is going to make it very difficult for any enslaved person to be on US soil. So Harriet herself moves everybody through Niagara, sometimes through Rochester, up to St. Catharines. And that's where she starts her first philanthropic organization, which is a place where those that have escaped north can find food, clothing, shelter. They can be trained for a job. They can help be found. They can help to find a job. They can help them find farmland and purchase that. So her philanthropic organization helps settle many people that have gone into Canada. But there's one person that's another head scratcher. And this is towards the Civil War time, right before the war starts. Harriet Tubman is going to make a trip down where she picks up only one person. And that person is Margaret Stewart, a 10-year-old girl living down in Dorchester County, Maryland. Now, what is believed, and of course, it's 50% of historians and family members don't believe this is true, and the others do. So we're not sure, but Harriet Tubman may have given birth to a child in 1850, perhaps her first trip down on the Underground Railroad in Baltimore, so a slave state. And the law stated that whatever legal status the mother is, so is the child. So Harriet Tubman is enslaved, so that meant that her children would be enslaved as well. So what is believed is that Harriet Tubman gave her child to a free Black family, one that just had a child, so they could say they had twins instead of a single birth. And this changes Margaret's legal status to free. And there's so many plot twists in this story, but what essentially happens is that family moves from Baltimore down to Dorchester County, Maryland, close to Harriet Tubman's parents. And Margaret, as she is growing up, would remember Harriet Tubman on her trips down on the Underground Railroad would come visit her, not her family. She would come visit Margaret. And then Harriet Tubman goes down and grabs Margaret, and Margaret will say for the rest of her life, She's kidnapped by Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet had backing, financial backing on this trip because she had enough money to buy a ticket on an ocean-going vessel to go north, and then enough money to get a train for both these people to come up to Auburn. And then Harriet Tubman turns Margaret over to the Sewards, and the Sewards will look after Margaret for the duration of the war and teach her how to read and write, how to manage a large house, how to dress as a wealthy woman. So it's a very interesting story about Margaret. She is never claimed by Harriet Tubman, but she certainly was very close to her entire life. Tubman during the Civil War, which is very common. This is the story that goes around in school. Of course, we know she was a nurse, a scout, a spy, but she also led a military raid up the Combahee River and helped 700 enslaved people escape that particular night. And they follow the Union Army out, of which Harriet Tubman is working for the Army at that time and leading them out. After the Civil War, we have the passage of the 13th Amendment. And I bring this up because when we think of the 13th Amendment, we go, okay, this means that slavery is dead. But if we look at this a little closer, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. And this little caveat, except as a punishment for crime, is going to be the re-enslavement of Black people. There's an amazing book, won the Pulitzer on this topic. I highly recommend, so we can send that out if you're interested in reading it. But when we also look at Harriet Tubman and the world that she's living in, even after the Civil War, after everything she did, she's very well versed in politics. And the 13th Amendment was certainly something that was on her mind, because with this punishment for crime start the Jim Crow laws, Black codes, and other kinds of incarceration, especially incarcerated. And then they're sold, these prisoners, to private companies for labor. This picture was taken in Auburn later in Harriet Tubman's life. Of course, we have Harriet Tubman on the left. Her second husband, Nelson Davis, is the one that has the cigar in his mouth and the hat on. He was about 22 years younger than Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet felt she was married to Tubman for her entire life until she found out that he had been murdered, which is about 1869. At that point, she will marry then Nelson Davis. Now, Nelson Davis, the family felt that he wasn't good enough for Harriet Tubman. And we started to look at him as, okay, what was his life like? So he is born enslaved. We don't know what he went through as an enslaved person. Being enslaved alone is traumatic. He then was in the Civil War. We know the different battles that he fought in. He saw horrific, just horrific, I don't want to call them action, but the military battles that he was in were horrific. And then he gets out of the war to find out that he's dying of tuberculosis. And this is why he has knocked on Harriet Tubman's door to see if she can help him get over this disease. At this point in Harriet's life, she has opened her door to many people. Anybody who needs food, clothing, shelter, and medical care come to her house in Auburn, and she never turns anyone away. The little girl next to Nelson Davis, these are nieces and nephews. The young woman between Harriet and Nelson Davis is Gertie. Gertie was actually adopted by both Harriet Tubman and Nelson Davis. We don't know a lot about her other than she was more than likely an unadoptable child suffering from syphilis. She does have a son that dies at about 3 months of syphilis, and then Gertie heads to the Ohio Territory. We don't know what else happened to her, so we will plan to be doing more research on Gertie. Harriet Tubman, also in freedom in Auburn, will start forming different organizations, and she will help start the National Association of Colored Women. And this is their motto, lifting as we climb. And this organization is still alive and well today. They are still fighting many of the things that Harriet Tubman had brought to the inaugural meeting. They will initially be starting to fight against that convict leasing system created by the 13th Amendment. They'll start with gerrymandering and keeping Blacks from the vote. So there's a lot of things that they will do to make life better, like starting Black schools, Black hospitals, and Harriet Tubman, of course, very interested in starting a Black nursing home, especially in the Auburn area. There was one at that time, a nursing home in Auburn, but it would not allow Black people to be patients. They could work there, but they could not be patients. So these are all the things that are being worked on by this organization, plus some. Harriet will also help build this particular church, the Thompson Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And this is what the National Park Service now owns and the adjacent rectory. And we are rehabbing this particular building and the rectory, which should be open this spring or summer. So we hope you come down to take a look at it. And it will be our visitor center, and we'll also have exhibits in the church and tours going on. So we hope you come down and visit us. But this was Harriet Tubman's church. She actually will join the church, which had started back about 1838. It's one of the first African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches started in the country. Zion represents the Freedom Church. So this church was very involved with the Underground Railroad. But the church that Harriet's congregation was in was really falling apart. It wasn't in good shape. And Harriet wanted to make sure that her congregation had a solid home. So she helped with the fundraising and to push the congregation to build this church. And this was the home of the congregation for just over 100 years. The congregation is still alive and well. They have another church that they're in Auburn. And if you go there on Sunday morning, Harriet Tubman's great-great-grandniece, Pauline Coates Johnson, plays the piano every Sunday, and she is 94 years old. So the Home for the Aged and Infirm Negroes, which Harriet Tubman starts, is actually going to initially start in her home with what we were just talking about. Anybody who needed help, they can just come to her house and she will help them. So she actually becomes incorporated under that name, the Home for Aged and Infirm Negroes, in her house. But then she will buy 25 acres adjacent to her property, which had several houses on it, including a brick structure that she called John Brown Hall. She actually knew him, and he had asked her to come on his raid, which she did not do, thank goodness, because of course the raid failed. And many of those that went on the raid were caught, as well as, I'm going to have it. Sorry, forgot. But a lot were hung after the John Brown raid. So he said that he thought that raid, if he started it, would then ignite a war so that could get rid of slavery. He was hoping that insurrection would then get rid of slavery. And this is John Brown Hall. Harriet Tubman is in the front row with a shawl on. This building would serve them very well for a number of years. It had between 8 and 12 patients in there, as well as a clinic. So anybody that needed medical care could come there one day a week and get free medical. A lot of the women that are in the picture are those that were the matrons who took care of those that were the patients. So this is Harriet Tubman's actual last 2 years of her life. This is her home. She actually had to go into her own nursing home. So a lot of her friends in Auburn raised money to be able to make sure that she had the nursing and the supplies that she needed to be able to be comfortable the last couple of years of her life. She will pass away in 1913. She is approximately 92 years old. at that time. She would always say she was older. She wanted to be as old as her mother, but she didn't make, she was about 92. Her mother was about 95. And this is a close-up of her. They believe that this is probably the last picture of Harriet Tubman before her passing. It looks like the black shawl that's behind it is probably somebody who's helping her sit up. This is inside the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church, and this is the open casket of Harriet Tubman. And the women that surround her are the matrons that were at the Home for the Aged. And the picture in the upper left is her casket coming out of the church. The church is in very, very excellent original shape. So those stained glass windows and the corbels and all around the door, all of that is still there. She's buried in Fort Hill Cemetery. It was just a stone's throw from the church. And this is one of the pictures of the second home for the aged. You can actually say it's the third for residents, John Brown Hall, and then moved up to this building, a wood structure that was on that 25 acres. And we were confused as we're looking like, why did they move from that brick structure that was quite sound to this one? And at the same time, they moved up to the wood frame houses when they brought the water main. The city brought it down on South Street. So it would have been a lot less expensive for the home to be hooked up to water if they were in the structure. So we think that's why they moved. And this building was able to hold more people. It was said that the second floor was probably a dormitory with a couple bedrooms downstairs for those that were not ambulatory. And over the years, it was just not feasible for the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, who Harriet Tubman had given the property and the home to. They just couldn't keep up with it. It was too expensive for them. They had started charging people for admittance into the home, and it was just something they couldn't keep up. So it fell into disrepair. As you can see, very serious disrepair here. And this is also that same building. And if you look at the picture in the right lower corner, somebody tried to set it on fire. So it was in very bad shape. In about 1950, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church actually put the money into it to restore it. And so it was brought back to this. It was actually not restored to the original, but it's a little bit bigger. It's a little bit different than the original. It has a little higher roof, and they put in an apartment on the second floor for the caretaker, but you can still go in this building, and it's on the side of the original. And it was where the last of the patients lived until everyone had passed, and then they had closed the doors. And so the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church has this open for tours. Some of Harriet Tubman's things are in here, donated by Harriet Tubman's family. And this is a picture of Pauline Coates Johnson in the center with two of her daughters, and again, the great-great-grandniece. They're very, very active within the local community, which is wonderful. We also bring a lot of children through the site. We have them do like they're doing now, which is archaeology. We know after the fire of Harriet Tubman's actual residence that they just dug a ditch, like a builder's ditch, and threw in all the debris from the fire. That was only discovered about 20 years ago. And there's about 65,000 artifacts. And so by the children doing this kind of archaeology, we make sure it has things in there so that they can tell the difference between archaeology and fossils and paleontology. And also what kind of clues they would get from finding these things in the ground about Harriet Tubman, because certainly those 65,000 artifacts have yielded quite a bit of information about Harriet Tubman. And this is just some of the children coming from the Booker T. Washington Community Center, their camp program. And they come over, and we certainly put them through that archaeology program because everybody likes playing in the dirt. And as you can see, they have their activity book, and we're very excited to have the children over there. So I'm going to stop sharing. and see if anybody has any questions.
I have a question about where did Harriet Tubman get all the money to make these trips back and forth and to buy a house and to do the things she did?
Excellent question. She knew a lot of very wealthy people, such as Lucretia Mott. Martha Copland Wright was not as wealthy, but certainly from the Stewards. We knew when she was in Auburn, would go to other churches in the community on Sunday morning. She would listen to what the minister said. And then after church, she would go up to some of the wealthiest people in the community and say, okay, I heard what the minister said, I need this kind of money. So these are the things that pretty much where she got some of her money for the things that she did once the war was over and she was in Auburn. During the Underground Railroad years, she got a lot of the money from William Still and some of the people within the abolitionist movement. She also would go on this talk circuit, and it's just kind of boggles our mind that she was not captured. But I think from what I've read, it looks like she was female, she was small, petite, she was a master at disguise. I think she really was playing on those things to be able to really operate under the radar. No one could imagine someone as small and a woman doing the feats that she did. But she would also do some fundraisers and get paid for those talks. And like I said, some of the abolitionists would help her out. Good question.
Did she ever learn to read and write?
She never did. She never learned to read and write, which does not mean that she wasn't very intelligent, very business savvy, but she just had like a little chip mark that she would put, like if she was accepting coal at the house, it's just a little chip mark. So no, she never learned, but she did understand the value of an education. So she was very much for creating Black schools, especially for Black girls. She even had a bazaar in Auburn to raise money for the Freedmen's Bureau to support Black schools. And it was equivalent to about what she earned from that bazaar, about $15,000 in today's money. So she did quite well. And what was that? Let me see the chat here. I just saw one come in. Let's see, were you involved in providing information for the recent film on Tubman? We were not involved in that, but the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church was. And the film, as so many times, it was stretched, so we say. So Harriet Tubman, no one knew who she was, so no one was chasing her. But that doesn't mean that didn't happen to someone trying to go north on the Underground Railroad. I think there was a Gabriel in the movie who was supposed to be the son of her owner who was chasing her. That never happened. There was no Gabriel, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen to somebody. We do know, like, George Washington pursued Ona Judge, his enslaved person, for many, many years. So things like this happened to other people, but not to Tubman. Let's see, did Harriet Tubman go south and rescue family members? She did. So over the course of about 10 years, she makes 13 trips and brings up about 70 people, mostly family members and friends. But she's not going to bring up anybody she doesn't know, because Black and white were slave catchers. So she made sure she only brought up people she knew. And did her family ever join her in Auburn? They did. Right before the Civil War, she brought down those that wanted to go south, her mother and father especially, and brought them to the house. And then she got promises from her wealthy friends in Auburn to look after her family while she left for the war. So she made sure that they were cared for before she left. Any other questions?
I appreciate your comment about William Still. I've read some of his works, and it's kind of neat to see he took very meticulous care to get their stories as the freedom seekers were running to find out where they went, where they came from, where they want to go. He was pretty smart. Thomas Garrett was another guy down in Delaware So
Mhm.
Harry kind of went through Delaware on the way to Philadelphia,
Right.
and wound up coming our way, if you will. People ask, I've always been curious about her connection with Frederick Douglass. And on one of the trips that William Still writes about, there's a number of runaways that Harriet's part of that they kind of wind up at Frederick Douglass's back door
They
in
did.
Rochester on the way to Canada.
Yes, one in particular, one trip was very well documented that she and those she was bringing north stayed with Douglass.
Yeah.
And William Still is very interesting, having been born enslaved. His mother wanted to take all 4 children that she had north to freedom. So she tries it with all 4, got captured and returned. And so she had to make that unbelievable decision. She was going to leave again, but she couldn't take all 4, and she only took 2. She had to make the decision of which 2 children did she think could survive better in enslaved. And so William Still and one other child was brought by the mother north to Philadelphia, and they were successful that time. And one of the reasons that William Still was always taking these notes down was because of the split in his family, which is the horror of enslavement. You never knew from one day to another if you were going to be with your loved ones or not. And so at one point, he is taking down notes from this one gentleman who was heading north. And the gentleman's information was very similar to his. And it turned out he was interviewing his brother that had been left behind so many years ago. So it was a really, it was a personal thing with William Still to make sure those records were kept. And even after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, he continued to do that, where so many people burned their records and left their work on the Underground Railroad behind, because the law was so strict and the fines and prison sentences were very steep, but it didn't stop William Still.
It's important to remember that what they were doing was all illegal.
Yes.
I mean, as far as the laws went, so anything that he did, anything that Harriet did, and even her family, if they were hiding out, their friends, it's all illegal. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also a miracle that the Seward family was never persecuted. They were never touched, probably because about the time that all of this is happening, that William Still is a senator from the state of New York. But there were a lot of blind eyes that were turned away from what Frances Seward was doing, because her home was open as a station on the Underground Railroad. They had documentation that this was going on, the letters between Frances and William. So I mean, it was pretty much common knowledge. And the 2 family members, the Bogarts, who worked for the Sewards, were also very involved with the Underground Railroad along with the Freemans. And no one said anything. So let's see, what was the age difference between Nelson and Harriet? It's about 20 to 22 years difference. And we think that marriage may have been one of more of convenience. We know he has tuberculosis. It's a wasting disease. It more than likely is going to kill you. We understand he was very ill when he shows up at Harriet's house. And so this could have been Nelson saying to Harriet, look, I can't pay you for the care you're giving me, but if you marry me when I die, you will get my pension from the military, which is exactly what happened. It took a long time before she got it, but she eventually did get it. And Nelson he lived for about 20 more years, and he became a brickmaster, which was one of the major industries for the Black community in Auburn, was making brick. And even Harriet Tubman had a brick kiln and also sold bricks. So it's Nelson Davis and Harriet Tubman and other family members who built the brick house that stands there today after the original one burned to the ground. And let's see, did Harriet Tubman ever meet Susan B. Anthony? And yes. We are not sure exactly how close they were. They did meet. We know on one of the big conventions in Rochester in Harriet Tubman's later life, that she came in holding on to Susan B. Anthony's arm, and the whole auditorium just went crazy. They were clapping and hooting and just so excited that Harriet Tubman was there with Susan B. Anthony. But we're just not sure exactly how close they were. Susan B. Anthony was pretty busy at that time. So
Oh, she was from an abolitionist family too.
she was.
Yeah.
She was. Yeah.
I had read where Harriet on that raid going south, the same time area when the 54th and 55th were coming into the Battery Wagner outside of Charleston. And the night before the big raid, the black troops were going to raid the Confederate fortress there, that Harriet was in the mess hall serving meals of some, or in that area, put it that way, as was Clara Barton, the Red Cross founder.
Yeah, we're not sure if they actually met, if that was actually, that's something that we just
a
don't know.
parallel,
It doesn't look, it looks like they're in the same vicinity, but we don't know if they actually knew each other. And there's still a lot of division just because of skin color at that time. So we're just not sure. We know that Harriet, just to make some money while she's in service, because she doesn't really get paid. It's more of a, she gets some expenses paid, we believe, at one time, but she actually will make like pies, and I think she makes cider or something like that, and then she sells that to the troops. So for her to be handing out food and all that seems to be very fitting.
Yeah.
She was also part of the Port Royal experiment down in South Carolina. So basically the federal government halfway through the Civil War was like, well, we might just win this thing. And if we win it, that means that 4.3 million enslaved people are going to be free. Are they going to be able to assimilate into society? Is this going to be successful? So the Port Royal experiment that Harriet was part of is, is this going to be doable? And so Harriet worked with a lot of the female contrabands. So these are the enslaved people who've walked away from their farms, from the plantations, and are following the Northern Army. And she works with the women and teaches them how to cook, clean, and sew, and what to charge for these services, because they can immediately start this work with the soldiers that are there. And it's a huge success. So you can even credit Harriet with convincing the federal government that these 4.3 million people can assimilate into our society. So let's see, how about Frederick Douglass? So Cass, what do you mean about Frederick Douglass?
Did she meet him?
Yes, she stayed at his house with one of the trips that's very well documented, that he opened his door to Harriet Tubman and those that she was bringing north. So yes, they did know each other, but we don't think, that's another one where we don't think they knew each other well. Again, they're kind of moving in different spheres almost. And when Harriet Tubman's book was written, she is saying that she's telling Sarah Bradford, her biographer, all these stories, and Sarah Bradford doesn't really believe a lot of this, so she writes letters to a lot of people. One of them was to Frederick Douglass, asking him to corroborate Harriet Tubman's story. And so Frederick Douglass writes back, and I don't know this verbatim, can't recite it verbatim, but he is saying that the crowds see his work. He stands up and he orates, and people see his work and knows what he's doing. But for Harriet Tubman, the only witnesses to her work were the poor souls that she brought north and the stars over her head. So in other words, he's telling Sarah Bradford, you got to believe what she's saying, because this is her experience and you don't have people out there watching what she's doing. So that was a very fitting letter he wrote back for Harriet Tubman. And one of the things that I can't stress enough, and I know a lot of times we really concentrate on Harriet Tubman, but with the first people that arrive, the first white people that arrive here in America are bringing enslaved people with them. So when we talk about, as I just said, like our country, it's not our country. It's already land inhabited by native peoples. And then when we talk about the white population landing here and establishing colonies, that is all done hand in hand with enslaved people. And the legacy of so many of the things that happened over the years we still live with. And I can't stress enough some of these books that I've delved into, and some of my really renowned historians are really opening my eyes to our history, where I am looking at it very, very differently than I did just 6 years ago. So I highly encourage going to the library and getting some of these books and really delving into it. I know they'd be able to point you in the good direction about some of the new history that's out. It's quite the eye opener. So let's see, what's another? What do we know of her personality? Was she friendly, charismatic, serious? That is such a good question, because it's so hard to tell. Nobody really is looking at that at the time she was alive. So we have to go by kind of some anecdotes. We do know that her mother was very forceful. She loved two things in life, and that was tobacco and tea. And so Harriet Tubman would try to get those things for her, but she's also trying to get money together so that she can take care of the people in the house with food and medicine. So at one point, she said that it was her mother was nagging so much, she went into the closet and she just sat there until things quieted down. And then she went into town and bartered so her mother could have her tobacco and tea. So she's very much a family person. She's very much, she loves her parents for all the things that you can tell that she had done for them. And then there's the other anecdote about taking some enslaved people on the train over the Niagara Bridge. So over the chasm where you see the Niagara Falls in the distance, and that bridge, I got it was very, very high above the river. And they were scared. They'd never been off of the farms they'd been working on, and here they're on this train, they're going to go over this bridge. And she says, okay, put your heads down and I will tell you when we're over the bridge. So just cover your eyes and I'll tell you when we're over. Well, halfway over the bridge, the train's halfway over, she would say, okay, we're all done, we're over the bridge. And they all look out, and of course they're halfway, they're way over the river, they can see Niagara Falls. And she would laugh. She thought that was funny. So she did have a sense of humor. Well, any other questions? Is there a way to get a copy or link of this presentation to share with others? Nancy would be the one to, Nancy Nugent would be the one to get that link from.
Yes, I recorded this wonderful discussion and I will send everyone the link. It takes a while for Zoom to process it, so I will do that tomorrow.
And Kim, you also mentioned some books or some titles that maybe you can add that to the list of things that Nancy's going to be sending.
I'll send her one. Let's see, this one, it just moves, but this is always close at hand. Slavery by Another Name. This is the one I mentioned earlier. It won the Pulitzer, and it's by Douglas Blackman. And this is, it's a little threadbare because it's one of those books that you can't read a lot. You have to read a little, put it down, and then kind of think about what you just learned. But this was the real, this information really turned my mind around for me to understand. I really did not know the history as well as I thought I did. And so this sent me on a whole new journey after reading this one. So I highly recommend that one.
That's a great book. It kind of brings things in closer to 2022.
It really does.
Think about what he talks about with the Klan, the sharecropping, the lynchings, Jim
Mhm.
Crow, all that, you know.
Yeah, the black codes, and a lot of it comes out of that 13th Amendment, which
Yeah.
again, I never put that together with so many of the things that happened after the Civil War. But just that little caveat, unless the punishment for crime was an open door to re-enslaving Black people. And not exclusively Black, but the majority were Black. So highly recommend that one. So thank you all so much for having me tonight. If you have any questions, maybe Nancy, you could send out my email too. So if anybody has any more questions.
Yes, I can do that.
Okay. And thank you all so much. You have a wonderful evening.
We'll see you in Auburn.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Hey, bye-bye. Goodbye, Kimberly.
Bye, Nancy. You need anything, you just call, okay?
Pardon?
You just call if you need anything.
Okay, thank you.
And I hope you get over your cold real soon.
Yeah, me too. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Careful.
Bye-bye.
Bye.